Imagine spending the first 13 years of your life locked in a room, unable to speak, never seeing other people, never experiencing the outside world. This was the reality of Genie Wiley, a girl deprived of everything that makes someone human. When she was finally rescued, the world didn't know if it was witnessing an irreparable tragedy or a unique scientific opportunity. In this video, you'll discover the shocking details of Genie's captivity, what led her into this situation, how she was rescued, and what happened after the world learned about her existence. We'll also uncover the critical mistakes scientists made and why this case remains an open wound in the history of psychology. Stay until the end, because Genie's story isn't just heartbreaking. It exposes how cruel, negligent, and ambitious adults can be, even when they claim to be helping. This is one of the most disturbing cases you'll ever hear about. Before she was rescued, before she became the center of worldwide scientific attention, Genie Wiley was known by no one. In truth, it was as if she didn't even exist. A ghost hidden behind four walls. A girl invisible to the world, and even to her own family. But who was Genie? What led her to live so many years in total silence and isolation? To understand that, we have to go back to the beginning. Not just to Genie's birth, but to the dysfunctional and deeply disturbed family structure that was the true cradle of her nightmare. Clark Wiley, Genie's father, was a deeply disturbed man. The product of a childhood marked by trauma, rejection, and loss, he became an adult who was rigid, paranoid, and emotionally unstable. He hated noise. He couldn't stand the sound of children crying, and he was completely obsessed with absolute control over everyone in his house. Clark believed the world was a cruel place, and that his mission was to protect his family by keeping them away from all outside influence. But that protection translated into forced isolation, psychological and physical abuse, and an atmosphere of constant fear. He banned almost everything: television, radio, visitors, long conversations, affection. Everything was seen as a threat. Everything was tightly monitored. Silence was enforced with punishment. And when Genie was born, things got even worse. Irene, Genie's mother, was nearly blind and completely submissive to her husband. She was afraid of him. She never challenged his rules. And even though she knew her daughter was suffering, she stayed silent. Not out of cruelty, but because of fear, emotional dependency, and deep psychological weakness. She had lost children before. When Genie was born, premature and showing signs of developmental delays, Clark seemed to decide she wasn't normal enough for society. That's when he made a terrifying choice. He would hide her. Irene tried to seek help a few times, but always gave up. It was as if she too was imprisoned, not in a room like Genie, but in an invisible cell made of fear and manipulation. Genie had an older brother, John Wiley. He too suffered at the hands of their father, but lived a slightly different reality. He was allowed to go to school and had minimal contact with the outside world. However, he never spoke out about what was happening to his sister. For years, he was the only other person, besides the parents, who knew of Genie's existence. But the silence inside that house was so suffocating that no one dared to break it. Genie spent the first 13 years of her life locked in a back room of the house. A small space with covered windows and barely any natural light. She slept in a modified baby chair, where she was strapped by her arms, legs, and waist for hours every day. When not in the chair, she was confined to a metal crib with mesh sides, with no blankets, no toys, and no visual stimuli. Her father forbade all sound. If Genie made any noise, she was beaten. Her only contact with others was when someone entered to feed her, usually cold, liquid food, quickly shoved in her mouth. No words were spoken, no eye contact, no affection. Genie was raised in total emotional, social, and sensory deprivation. She never learned to speak. She could barely walk. She didn't recognize objects, emotions, or even understand what the world was. It was as if her childhood had been stolen in slow motion. It's hard to imagine anyone surviving in an environment like that. But Genie survived, and when she was discovered by authorities, the scientific world didn't just see a victim, it saw an opportunity. For over a decade, Genie Wiley existed without ever truly living. She breathed, but she wasn't alive. Her body grew, but her mind remained frozen in time. While other children her age were learning to ride bikes, sing, write, or simply play with friends, Genie was locked away, ignored, forgotten. She didn't know what a birthday was. She didn't know what a school was. She had never experienced a hug, and no one, outside of her own family, even knew she existed. Until one ordinary day, without warning or grand plans, fate finally intervened. On November 4th, 1970, Irene Wiley, Genie's mother, made a decision that would change everything. Nearly blind and dependent on social support, she walked into a welfare office in Temple City, California, to apply for assistance for the visually impaired. For reasons still unclear, perhaps fear, perhaps hope, she brought Genie with her. The social worker who greeted them was immediately struck by the girl's bizarre appearance and behavior. Genie looked like she was no more than 7, yet her documents said she was nearly 14. She moved awkwardly, with her arms held tightly to her sides and her hands twisted in strange, claw-like positions. She wouldn't make eye contact. She muttered odd, unintelligible sounds. She didn't speak, and most of all, she radiated a quiet but terrifying sense of pain. The social worker knew something was terribly wrong. She didn't ignore it. She made a report. That same day, Child Protective Services were alerted. Within hours, Genie was officially removed from her parents' custody and rushed to the Children's Hospital at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles. It was the end of her physical captivity, but the beginning of a series of discoveries that would shock the fields of medicine, psychology, and society at large. Upon arrival at the hospital, Genie was evaluated by a multidisciplinary team. Doctors, psychologists, neurologists, and social workers spent hours observing her behavior and examining her body. What they found was deeply disturbing. At 13 years old, she weighed just 59 pounds, 27 kilograms, the average weight of an 8-year-old. Her physical stature was severely underdeveloped. Her pelvic bones were malformed, suggesting years of restricted movement. She walked with bent knees and shuffled her feet, evidence of long confinement in a modified potty chair. Her vision was intact, but her attention span was almost non-existent. She couldn't chew solid food. She wore diapers. Most shockingly, her vocabulary consisted of fewer than 20 words, many of which were used incorrectly or nonsensically. Genie didn't know the names of body parts. She didn't recognize human emotions. She didn't respond to facial expressions. She showed no typical signs of social behavior. She was a teenager with the developmental level of an infant raised without love, stimulation, or freedom. News of the case spread like wildfire. Newspapers and television stations across the country ran headlines like, "The Wild Child of Los Angeles. Girl raised in complete isolation. 13 years of silence." And even more sensationalistic ones, "The Monkey Girl," or "The Missing Link Between Man and Animal." The public was stunned. How had this happened? How could a child be raised in the suburbs of California like some kind of medieval experiment without anyone noticing? But alongside the outrage came another question, one that fascinated the scientific community. Could she be saved? Could she still learn to speak? Was her mind still capable of development after so many lost years? Genie quickly became more than just a rescued child. She became a scientific opportunity. She was a living, breathing case study of something that could never be ethically replicated. What happens when a human being grows up without language, social interaction, or cultural exposure? And so, while some truly wanted to help, others began to treat her as a human experiment. She was taken in by a multidisciplinary research team at the Children's Hospital of Los Angeles. Every day, she was tested, linguistically, neurologically, psychologically. Her progress was filmed. Her responses were analyzed. Reports were written and published. She was no longer locked in a bedroom, but now she was trapped in another kind of prison, the prison of scientific curiosity. Genie had been freed from one form of abuse, only to face another, subtle, but just as invasive. The abuse of being seen not as a person, but as a puzzle to be solved. Her first 13 years were stolen from her, and now she faced the challenge of surviving in a world that wanted to study her more than it wanted to understand her. When Genie was rescued, the hope was that she would finally live a life with dignity, that with love, care, and patience, she could reclaim at least part of the childhood that had been stolen from her. But the reality turned out to be far more complex and far more cruel than any story of redemption might suggest. Genie's story attracted attention from around the world, not just from journalists or concerned citizens, but from scientists, psychologists, linguists, neurologists, and human development specialists. For the first time, science had before a so-called natural experiment, a child who had grown up without language, affection, or social interaction. The kind of case that could never be ethically replicated, because doing so would be criminal. And so, Genie became something else entirely, a subject of research. After her rescue, Genie was placed under the care of a medical team at the USC Children's Hospital. The team was led by psychologist David Rigler and included prominent specialists such as linguist Susan Curtis and neurologist James Kent. What was supposed to be a support network quickly turned into a battleground between compassion and curiosity. On one side were those who wanted to understand the limits of brain plasticity. Could a child who missed the critical period for language acquisition still learn to speak? On the other were those who simply wanted to provide Genie with what she had never had: attention, affection, and stability. And in the middle of this tug of war was Genie, confused, vulnerable, and once again, without any control over what was happening to her. From the beginning, Genie was subjected to an intense and exhausting routine of tests, evaluations, and observations. She was filmed almost daily. Her reactions were documented in detail. Every minor improvement was recorded like a data point. It was as if Genie had become a spreadsheet, a walking chart. Yes, she did show some progress. She learned new words, started forming short sentences, showed timid signs of empathy and curiosity. But the process was slow, painful, and often frustrating. And for the more ambitious researchers, this pace was viewed as a missed opportunity. The focus began to shift from how can we help her live to what can we extract from her while we still can. She was tested with sounds, pictures, objects, instructions. It was as if the team was trying to squeeze every last insight out of her before she became useless to the research. And this is where things became even more problematic. David Rigler, the lead psychologist, not only conducted the research, but also became Genie's foster parent. He and his wife took her into their home. On the surface, it looked like a generous act. After all, Genie needed a home. But this overlap between professional and personal roles created an extremely dangerous conflict of interest. How can someone care for a person while also studying them like a specimen? Where does love end and experimentation begin? The truth is, no one really knew. And Genie, once again, was at the mercy of adults who believed they were doing the right thing, even when their actions seemed more motivated by academic ambition than by genuine concern. Soon, scientific papers began to appear. Genie's case became the subject of university lectures, academic conferences, and heated debates. The central question remained: can the human mind recover after so many years in the dark? Susan Curtis, one of the linguists most closely involved, later said that Genie had sharp perception, emotional depth, and untapped intelligence. She wasn't just a subject, she was a human being trying desperately to make sense of a world that had never made room for her. But even with these testimonies, the testing never stopped. And over time, hope turned into frustration. Genie wasn't progressing fast enough. She wasn't useful anymore. And slowly, she was no longer interesting to science. Eventually, funding ran out. The studies came to a halt. Visits dwindled. The girl who had once been at the center of international attention disappeared into silence once more. But this time, the silence wasn't created by a locked door. It was institutional neglect. Genie was moved between foster homes, care facilities, and eventually psychiatric institutions. In some of those places, she was abused again. She regressed. She stopped speaking. She lost most of the progress she had made. Science walked away. The media forgot. And the world that had once been so eager to study her never truly learned how to care for her. It's hard not to wonder, could Genie have had a real chance if she had simply been embraced, not analyzed? Did scientific progress justify the emotional cost of a life already devastated? At this stage in her story, Genie's case was no longer about discovery. It was about ethics, about ambition, about how far people are willing to go when they hide behind a lab coat to satisfy their curiosity. When the research lights faded, so did Genie's last flicker of hope. After years of meticulous study and relentless exposure, driven more by scientific curiosity than by true emotional support, Genie was once again left behind. With no further academic funding and no plan for long-term care, she was thrown into a new chapter of her life, one marked by systemic neglect and institutional abandonment. What followed was a painful series of foster homes that failed to offer the stability, safety, and compassion she so desperately needed. Far from being a sanctuary, these homes became environments of uncertainty, places where her emotional and developmental needs were misunderstood, minimized, or outright ignored. Genie was passed from one caregiver to another, as if she were a temporary burden rather than a human being deserving of consistency and love. In some cases, she suffered new forms of abuse. In others, she simply existed in silence, without stimulation, without nurturing, without anyone who truly understood the depth of her trauma. Each move, each disruption, each broken promise added a new scar to a psyche already wounded beyond measure. As time went on, Genie began to withdraw more and more. The small gains she had made in language and emotional expression began to fade. The fear returned, the silence deepened, and the world, once again, failed her. The media, once obsessed with every detail of her life, vanished without a trace. The headlines stopped. The cameras turned away. Genie became a name whispered only in passing, a case referenced in textbooks, but rarely remembered as a human being. She was institutionalized, diagnosed, monitored, forgotten. She no longer belonged to the world of science. She no longer belonged to a family. She belonged to the system. The final abandonment of Genie Wiley isn't just a tragic footnote in history. It's a devastating reminder of how science, media, and society often fail the most vulnerable when their stories are no longer useful. Her journey forces us to ask hard questions. What is the cost of curiosity when it forgets compassion? What happens when we study a human being and forget that they are more than data points and test results? Genie was not an experiment. She was a child, a soul, a story we should never stop telling. Now that you've heard Genie Wiley's entire story, you may be feeling something heavy in your chest, a mix of sadness, anger, frustration, and helplessness. And that feeling is absolutely valid, because Genie's story isn't just about a girl locked in a room. It's about a society that doesn't know how to treat those who are different. It's about a system that prefers to analyze rather than protect. It's about adults who, even with the best intentions on the surface, too often become part of the same cycle of abuse, only more sophisticated, more institutional, more silent. Genie was a prisoner of her father, then a prisoner of science, and finally, a prisoner of forgetfulness. In every phase of her life, what she lacked most wasn't money or technology or expertise. She lacked humanity. She lacked compassion. She lacked something so simple, someone to look her in the eyes and say, "I'm here for you." Genie's case became the subject of papers, books, documentaries, academic debates. But her life didn't get any better because of it. She became a symbol, a case study, a headline, but she never became the protagonist of her own story. And that brings us to a painful question we all need to ask. Do we really care about the victims, or just about the stories they generate? It's easy to feel touched by a tragic story. Much harder is doing something about the pain it exposes. It's easy to comment, "How awful," or share a video. Harder is to realize that Genie is still alive, and still forgotten. Genie isn't just one isolated case. She's a mirror reflecting a world where children are silenced every day. Trauma is studied before it's healed. Science chases answers but forgets to offer care. Abandonment is disguised as bureaucracy. And time, instead of healing, often just deepens the forgetting. When we hear stories like Genie's, we tend to think we're facing something rare, extreme, even fictional. But the truth is, there are thousands of Genies in the world. Some live in violent homes, others in broken institutions, many in the streets, and many more right next to us, invisible by convenience. Genie Wiley is now over 60 years old. She lives under state care in California in a publicly funded adult care facility. Her whereabouts are protected. Very few people have access to her. What little is known suggests that she rarely speaks, avoids interaction, and lives in near total silence. And perhaps she doesn't even remember or know the scale her story once reached. She's not on social media. She doesn't post pictures. She doesn't film herself, but she is still alive. And that, in itself, is a miracle. Genie survived abandonment. She survived isolation. She survived being forgotten. And somehow, she endures. If you've made it this far, I invite you not to let this story fade away. Not just for Genie, but for all the silenced voices. For every forgotten child. For every human being reduced to a data point. This story must be told and retold so that it never happens again. Let Genie Wiley's name not be remembered only as the girl locked away for 13 years, but as a silent scream that still echoes today, reminding us, never again. If this story touched you in any way, if you felt sadness, anger, or a deep sense of injustice, I invite you not to stay silent. Leave a comment below. Share what this story made you feel, what it stirred in your heart. Share this video with someone who also needs to know what happened to Genie. And if you want to hear more true stories that make us reflect on the world, on humanity, and on ourselves, subscribe to the channel. Here, every story is told with truth, respect, and depth. Because some voices, like Genie's, should never be forgotten.